The train whistle screamed across the empty plains of Montana Territory, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo forever in the vast wilderness. Black smoke billowed from the engine as it pulled into Copper Creek Station, a small wooden platform that served the scattered ranches and mining claims in the area. The year was 1887, and civilization was still a fragile thing in these parts. As the train hissed to a stop, only one passenger stepped down onto the weathered planks. She was a woman in her mid-20s, wearing a simple brown dress and a dark bonnet that cast shadows across her face. Her hands trembled as she clutched a small carpet bag and what looked like a crumpled envelope. Something about the way she moved suggested she was in pain, or perhaps afraid. The woman pulled her bonnet lower as she looked around the empty platform. The train conductor helped her down, tipping his cap politely, but she barely acknowledged him. Her eyes darted nervously from side to side, as if she expected someone dangerous to emerge from the shadows at any moment. When a tumbleweed rolled across the platform in the afternoon wind, she actually jumped. "Ma'am, you all right?" asked the conductor, noticing her strange behavior. She nodded quickly, not meeting his eyes. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice was soft but strained, like someone trying very hard to sound normal when everything was wrong. As the train pulled away, leaving her alone on the platform, the woman reached inside her boot and pulled out a second piece of paper, one that had been carefully hidden. Her hands shook even more as she unfolded it and read the words written in desperate handwriting. "He's coming for you. Marcus hired man. Run now. Don't trust anyone. A friend who cares." The color drained from her face as she read those words. She looked over her shoulder again, scanning the horizon as if expecting to see riders approaching. Then she quickly stuffed the note back in her boot and tried to compose herself. That's when she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A tall man on horseback was riding toward the station, and her first instinct was to run. But there was nowhere to go, just empty plains stretching in every direction. She pressed herself against the station wall, trying to make herself invisible. The rider was a cowboy in his early 30s, wearing well-worn leather chaps and a hat that had seen better days. He had kind eyes and a strong jaw, the sort of man who looked like he could handle whatever trouble came his way. As he dismounted and approached the platform, he removed his hat politely. "Ma'am, I'm Abraham Cartwright," he said, his voice gentle but uncertain. "I'm looking for Miss Sarah Bennett. Would that be you?" The woman hesitated, clearly torn between fear and the need to answer. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, I'm Sarah." The lie came easily. She had been practicing it for weeks. Abraham's expression changed as he got a better look at her face. Even in the shadow of her bonnet, he could see the purple bruises along her jawline and the partially healed split in her lower lip. His jaw tightened with anger, though he tried to keep his voice calm. "Who did this to you?" he asked, taking a step closer. Sarah instinctively backed away, her hand moving protectively to her throat. I fell from a horse," she stammered, another lie that fooled no one. Abraham had seen enough injured horses and men to know the difference between an accident and violence. These were the marks of someone's fists, and recent ones at that. He felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Miss Sarah, I don't know what happened to you before you got on that train, but I want you to understand something," Abraham said, his voice steady and sure. "You're under my protection now. Nobody, and I mean nobody, is going to hurt you again. I'll protect you now." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes at those words. It had been so long since anyone had offered to help her, so long since she had felt even the possibility of being safe. But fear was stronger than hope in her heart. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Someone is coming for me. Someone dangerous. Then they'll have to go through me first," Abraham replied without hesitation. As they stood there on that lonely platform, Sarah realized she had a choice to make. She could keep running, keep looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life, or she could trust this stranger who had just promised to protect her. The hidden note in her boot felt like it was burning against her skin, a reminder that her past was catching up with her. Abraham helped her onto his wagon, noticing how she winced when he touched her arm gently. Her gloves covered her hands completely, and he suspected there were more bruises hidden beneath the fabric. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had been brutal and recent. As they rode toward his ranch, Sarah kept glancing back toward the train tracks, as if expecting to see riders pursuing them. Abraham noticed her nervousness but didn't press her for details. There would be time for questions later. Right now, she needed to feel safe. "My ranch isn't much," Abraham said, trying to make conversation. "But it's peaceful. Good land for raising cattle and horses. I think you'll like it." Sarah managed a small smile, the first he had seen from her. "It sounds wonderful," she said, and for a moment, she almost meant it. But as they crested the hill overlooking Abraham's ranch, Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her boot, where the warning note lay hidden. She knew that no place would be safe for long. The man hunting her had resources and connections that reached far beyond this remote corner of Montana. Abraham glanced at his new bride and wondered what kind of hell she had escaped from. Whatever it was, he meant what he had said. He would protect her, no matter what it cost him. Abraham's ranch house was simple but clean, with sturdy wooden walls and windows that looked out over rolling hills dotted with cattle. As they pulled up to the front porch, Sarah noticed how Abraham kept scanning the horizon, as if her nervousness was contagious. He helped her down from the wagon, and she winced again when his hand touched her shoulder. "Sarah," Abraham said gently, "I know we barely know each other, but I need to ask you something. Are you really a widow like your letter said?" Sarah's face went pale. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that her lies would eventually catch up with her. She looked down at her hands, still covered by those concealing gloves. "No," she whispered. "I'm not a widow." Abraham felt his stomach drop. "Then you're married? To someone else?" "Yes," she said, tears starting to fall. "But not by choice. Not anymore." Before Abraham could respond, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She reached in her boot and pulled out the hidden note, along with something else, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her hand shook as she unwrapped it, revealing several photographs and folded documents. "My real name isn't Sarah Bennett," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Elizabeth Morrison. And my husband is Judge Marcus Morrison of Denver." Abraham's blood ran cold at that name. He had heard it before, years ago when he was still wearing a badge. Marcus Morrison, a judge with a reputation for harsh sentences and political connections that reached all the way to Washington. But Abraham remembered something else about that name, something darker. "Judge Morrison," Abraham repeated slowly. "I know that name." Elizabeth looked up at him with surprise. "You do? I used to be a lawman," Abraham explained. "Left the job 3 years ago because I got tired of watching guilty men walk free while honest folks suffered." Marcus Morrison's name came up in several cases that never went anywhere. Cases involving missing witnesses and evidence that disappeared. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she handed him one of the photographs. "Then you'll understand why I had to run." Abraham looked at the photograph and felt sick. It showed a man lying dead in what looked like an alley, but this wasn't a random killing. The man had been beaten severely before being shot. Written on the back in Elizabeth's handwriting were the words, "James Crawford threatened to expose the vote-buying scheme. March 15th, 1887. Dear God," Abraham breathed. "You saw this happen. I saw Marcus kill him with my own hands," Elizabeth said, her voice stronger now that the truth was finally coming out. James Crawford was a newspaper editor who had been investigating corruption in Denver's city government. He found proof that Marcus was taking bribes to fix court cases and was planning to publish the story. Marcus invited him to our house for dinner, said he wanted to discuss a peaceful resolution. Elizabeth took a shaky breath before continuing. After dinner, Marcus suggested they take a walk to discuss things privately. I followed them because something felt wrong. I watched my husband beat that man to death in the alley behind our house, then shoot him to make it look like a robbery. When I tried to confront Marcus later, he did this to me. She pulled off one of her gloves, revealing bruises around her wrist in the perfect shape of a man's grip. Then she removed the other glove, showing more bruises and what looked like burn marks from a cigar. Marcus said if I ever told anyone what I saw, he'd kill me and make it look like an accident. He said no one would believe a hysterical woman over a respected judge anyway. But I couldn't live with that secret, so I started gathering evidence. Abraham looked through the other photographs and documents. There were pictures of 2 other crime scenes, copies of court documents showing suspicious case dismissals, and a list of names, witnesses who had died or disappeared before they could testify against Marcus's associates. "How did you get all this?" Abraham asked. "Marcus kept trophies," Elizabeth said with disgust. "He had a locked box in his study with photographs and newspaper clippings of all his victims. He was proud of what he'd done. I stole the key and copied everything I could before I ran." Abraham studied the evidence, his anger growing with each piece. This wasn't just about one murder. Marcus Morrison was part of a larger conspiracy that had been destroying lives for years. And now Elizabeth had the proof to bring it all down. "The note you found on me," Elizabeth continued, "it's not from friend. It's from Marcus's first wife, Catherine. She left it hidden in the house before she supposedly killed herself 5 years ago. I found it when I was searching for evidence. She knew what kind of monster she was married to, and she tried to warn the next woman." Abraham's jaw tightened as the full picture became clear. "How many people has he killed?" "The evidence shows at least 12 over the past 5 years, Elizabeth said. "Judges, lawyers, newspaper editors, witnesses, anyone who threatened to expose the corruption network he's part of. And now that I've run with this evidence, he'll never stop hunting me." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Abraham grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and moved to the window. 2 men in dark suits were riding up to the house, and they didn't look like friendly neighbors. "Stay behind me," Abraham ordered, positioning himself between Elizabeth and the door. One of the men dismounted and approached the porch. "Mr. Cartwright, we're looking for a woman who stole some valuable property from her husband in Denver. We have reason to believe she might have come this way." "Property?" Abraham called back. "What kind of property?" "The kind that belongs to Judge Marcus Morrison," the man replied. "He's offering $1,000 for her safe return, no questions asked." Abraham glanced back at Elizabeth, who had gone completely white. $1,000 was more money than most people in these parts saw in 5 years. It would be enough to pay off his ranch and have money left over. "And if I haven't seen any such woman?" Abraham asked. The second man, who had remained mounted, spoke up in a voice that carried clear menace. "Then we'll be moving on. But if we find out you're lying, well, Judge Morrison has a long reach. Accidents happen to folks who interfere with official business." Abraham felt Elizabeth's hand grip his arm tightly. He could turn her over right now and collect that reward. It would solve all his financial problems and keep him out of danger. But as he looked at her terrified face and thought about those photographs, he knew there was only one choice he could make. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description," Abraham called out firmly. "You boys best move along." The 2 men exchanged glances. Then the first one mounted his horse again. "We'll be in the area for a few more days," he said. "If you change your mind about that reward, you can find us at the hotel in town." As they rode away, Elizabeth collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your life for someone you barely know?" Abraham looked at her with steady eyes. "Because I said I'd protect you, and because 12 dead people deserve justice, even if it cost me everything I own." But even as he spoke those brave words, Abraham knew their troubles were just beginning. If those men were here, it meant Judge Marcus Morrison wasn't far behind. 3 days passed in tense quiet. Abraham spent his time reinforcing the doors and windows of the ranch house, while Elizabeth stayed inside, afraid to even look out the windows. Every sound made her jump: a bird landing on the roof, cattle moving in the distance, even the wind rattling the shutters. Abraham could see the fear wearing her down, making her thinner and more fragile with each passing hour. On the 4th morning, they heard what they had been dreading: a large group of horses approaching. Abraham grabbed his rifle and peered through the window. At least 8 men were riding toward the ranch, and leading them was a tall man in an expensive black suit riding a magnificent stallion. Even from a distance, Abraham could see the man carried himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to power. "He's here," Elizabeth whispered, recognizing her husband even from far away. That's Marcus. Judge Marcus Morrison was a handsome man in his 40s with silver streak hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they looked at. He wore his authority like expensive cologne, invisible but unmistakable. As the group reached the house, Marcus dismounted and straightened his coat with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. "Mr. Cartwright," Marcus called out in a rich, commanding voice. "I am Judge Marcus Morrison of Denver. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Abraham opened the door but kept his rifle visible. "Judge Morrison, I heard you might be coming this way." "Indeed. I'm here to collect my wife, who seems to have gotten confused and wandered off." Marcus smiled, but it was the cold smile of a predator. "Elizabeth, dear, come out here. It's time to come home. She's not going anywhere with you," Abraham said firmly. Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Mr. Cartwright, I appreciate your concern, but you're interfering with a legal matter. Elizabeth is my lawful wife, and she has taken certain items from my home without permission. That makes her a thief as well as a runaway wife." He reached into his coat and pulled out an official-looking document. "This is a warrant signed by the territorial judge, authorizing me to retrieve my property, both my wife and the items she stole. If you continue to harbor her, you'll be charged as an accessory to theft." Abraham had seen enough corrupt legal documents in his law enforcement days to recognize the real thing, and unfortunately, this one looked genuine. Marcus had used his connections to make Elizabeth's flight look like a crime instead of an escape from abuse. "What kind of property are we talking about, Judge?" Abraham asked, though he already knew the answer. "Personal correspondence, family photographs, some legal documents. Nothing that would interest anyone outside our family, but quite valuable to me for sentimental reasons." Marcus's voice was smooth as silk, but Abraham could hear the thread underneath. Behind Abraham, Elizabeth stepped into the doorway. She had found her courage somewhere in the past few days, and though she was still afraid, she was no longer willing to hide. "Tell him what those photographs really show, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. Marcus's expression hardened. "Elizabeth, you're hysterical. You've been under a great deal of stress, and it's affected your judgment. These good men don't need to hear your fantasies." "Fantasies?" Elizabeth stepped fully outside, and Abraham moved to stand beside her. "Tell them about James Crawford. Tell them about Rebecca Martinez and David Thompson and all the others." For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely angry instead of merely annoyed. "Gentlemen," he said to his men, "my wife has been suffering from delusions since the death of her father last year. She sometimes confuses her nightmares with reality." But Abraham noticed something important. Some of the men with Marcus were looking uncomfortable. They had signed on to help a judge retrieve his runaway wife, not to cover up multiple murders. Marcus might have legal authority, but he was starting to lose moral authority with his own hired help. "If she's delusional," Abraham said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "then you won't mind if she shows everyone those photographs she mentioned. After all, if they're just family pictures like you said, there's no harm in sharing them." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for this nonsense. Elizabeth, get in the wagon. Now." "No." The word came out stronger than Elizabeth had intended, surprising even herself. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Marcus. Not after what you did to James Crawford. Not after what you did to your first wife, Catherine." Several of the men shifted in their saddles at the mention of Marcus's first wife. Her supposed suicide had been big news in Denver, and some folks had always wondered about the circumstances. Marcus's composure finally cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about, you stupid woman. Catherine killed herself because she was weak, just like you're weak. Catherine left a note," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Hidden in the house where you couldn't find it. She knew you killed those people, and she knew you'd kill her too if she tried to expose you." "Enough," Marcus roared, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. "You're coming with me right now, or I'll drag you back to Denver by your hair." Abraham stepped in front of Elizabeth, his rifle now pointed directly at Marcus. "Judge or no judge, you touch her and you're a dead man." The tension stretched like a wire ready to snap. Marcus's men were looking between their employer and Abraham, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Some of them had families, and the idea of gunning down a man protecting an abused woman didn't sit well with them. Marcus seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. "Very well," he said, forcing his voice back to its earlier smoothness. "Mr. Cartwright, you have until tomorrow at sunset to turn over my wife and my property. If you don't, I'll return with federal marshals and enough men to burn this ranch to the ground." He remounted his horse and looked down at them with contempt. "Elizabeth, you always were too stupid to know what was good for you. But tomorrow, you're coming home whether you like it or not." As the group rode away, Abraham noticed that two of Marcus's men looked back toward the house with expressions that seemed more sympathetic than threatening. Maybe not all of them were as loyal to the judge as he believed. "He means it," Elizabeth said quietly. "He'll come back with more men, and he'll kill you to get to me." Abraham reloaded his rifle and checked the extra ammunition. "Then we'd better be ready for him." But as they watched the dust cloud disappear over the horizon, both of them knew that all the preparation in the world might not be enough. Marcus Morrison had the law on his side, unlimited resources, and absolutely nothing to lose. Tomorrow's sunset was less than 24 hours away, and it was starting to look like it might be their last. The sun was still high when Abraham saddled his fastest horse. "I need to ride into town," he told Elizabeth. "If Marcus is bringing federal marshals tomorrow, we need help." "What kind of help?" Elizabeth asked, though she was afraid of the answer. "The kind that comes with guns and the willingness to use them." Abraham checked his rifle one more time. "There are good men in Copper Creek who don't like the idea of corrupt judges pushing honest folks around." While Abraham was gone, Elizabeth did something she had been avoiding for days. She carefully unfolded Catherine Morrison's hidden note and read it completely for the first time. What she found made her hands shake worse than ever. The note wasn't just a warning, it was a map. Catherine had drawn a detailed sketch of an area about 5 miles north of town, near the old abandoned silver mine. Marked with small crosses were 12 locations, and next to each cross was a name and a date. James Crawford's name was there, along with 11 others Elizabeth recognized from Marcus's trophy collection. At the bottom of the note, Catherine had written, I buried the real evidence here before he could destroy it. Photos of the crime scenes he thinks no one saw. Testimony from witnesses he thinks he silenced forever. If something happens to me, this will prove what he really is. CM. Elizabeth's heart raced as she realized what this meant. Marcus's victims hadn't just disappeared. Catherine had documented their murders and hidden the proof. If Elizabeth could reach that location and recover Catherine's evidence, she would have enough proof to bring down not just Marcus, but his entire network of corruption. Abraham returned 2 hours later with 3 men Elizabeth had never seen before. They were all ranchers from the area, weathered men with hard faces and the steady hands of people accustomed to protecting what was theirs. Elizabeth, meet Tom Bradley, Frank Mueller, and Sam Jenkins, Abraham said. They've all had dealings with corrupt officials in the past, and they're not inclined to let it happen again. Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s with graying hair, tipped his hat to Elizabeth. Ma'am, Abraham told us what your husband did to those people in Denver. We can't let that stand. The way I see it, added Frank Mueller, a man who'd beat his own wife and murder innocent folks isn't much of a man at all, judge or no judge. Elizabeth showed them Catherine's note and explained what she had discovered. The men studied the map carefully, their expressions growing grimmer with each detail. That mine's been abandoned for 3 years, Sam Jenkins said. Good place to hide things you don't want found. But it's also good ground for an ambush if Morrison figures out what we're after. We'll have to split up, Abraham decided. Tom and Frank can help me fortify the ranch for tomorrow's fight. Sam, you're the best tracker among us. Can you and Elizabeth get to that mine and back before sunset? Sam nodded. We can do it, but it'll be dangerous. If Morrison has scouts watching the area, we'll be sitting ducks out there. I have to try, Elizabeth said. Without Catherine's evidence, it's just my word against a respected judge. With it, we can prove everything. As Sam and Elizabeth prepared to leave, Abraham pulled her aside. Are you sure about this? If something goes wrong out there, I might not be able to help you." Elizabeth looked at him with eyes that had found their strength. "Abraham, for the first time in years, I'm not just running away from something. I'm running toward justice. Catherine died trying to stop Marcus, and I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless." The ride to the abandoned mine took them through rough country, following game trails and creek beds to avoid being seen from the main roads. Sam proved to be as skilled as Abraham had claimed, finding routes that kept them hidden while still making good time. The mine was a collection of rotting wooden buildings clustered around a dark hole in the side of a hill. Equipment that had once been worth fortunes now sat rusting in the mountain air. Catherine's map led them to a spot behind the old assay office, where she had marked a large rock with a small carving of the letter C. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she and Sam moved the rock, revealing a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were photographs that made her stomach turn. Crime scenes that showed Marcus's victims, but taken from angles that proved someone had been watching and documenting his actions. There were also written statements from witnesses, people who had seen Marcus meeting with his victims before their deaths, but had been too afraid to come forward. "Dear God," Sam whispered as he looked through the evidence. "This proves he killed all of them." But the most damning piece of evidence was a letter in Marcus's own handwriting, apparently stolen from a study by Catherine before she died. In it, Marcus detailed his plans to eliminate a newspaper editor who was getting too close to the truth about vote buying in Denver's elections. The letter was addressed to someone called the Colonel and mentioned payments for services rendered. This proves Marcus isn't working alone, Elizabeth realized. He's part of something bigger. As they prepared to leave, Sam suddenly grabbed Elizabeth's arm. "Riders coming," he whispered. At least 4 of them, moving fast. They quickly reburied the empty box and made it look like the hiding spot had never been disturbed. Then they grabbed the evidence and ran for their horses. Elizabeth clutched Catherine's proof against her chest as they rode hard for home, knowing that Marcus's men were probably closing in behind them. The sun was setting by the time they reached Abraham's ranch, painting the sky the color of blood. Tom and Frank had spent the afternoon turning the house into a fortress, barricading windows and setting up defensive positions. Abraham met them at the door, relief flooding his face when he saw they had made it back safely. "Did you find it?" he asked. Elizabeth held up the metal box. "Everything Catherine promised and more. Marcus murdered all 12 people, and he had help doing it." Abraham looked at the evidence, then at the crimson sunset. "Good, because I just got word from town that Marcus is already on his way back. He's bringing 20 men and 2 federal marshals, and they'll be here within the hour." Elizabeth felt her brief moment of triumph fade into cold fear. They had the evidence they needed, but they might not live long enough to use it. "Then we'd better get ready," she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. As the last light faded from the sky, 5 people prepared to make their stand against overwhelming odds. Outside, they could already hear the distant sound of approaching horses. Marcus Morrison was coming to collect what he believed was his, but he was about to discover that some things were worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. The sound of horses filled the night air as Marcus Morrison's army approached Abraham's ranch. Through the barricaded windows, Elizabeth could see torches flickering in the darkness like angry stars. 23 men on horseback surrounded the house, and at their head rode Marcus himself, flanked by 2 men wearing federal marshal badges. "Abraham Cartwright." Marcus's voice boomed across the yard. "This is your final warning. Send out my wife and the stolen property, or we'll take this house apart board by board." Abraham stepped onto the porch, his rifle in his hands, but pointed at the ground. "Judge Morrison, before you do something you might regret, there are some things you need to know. The only thing I need to know is whether you're going to cooperate or resist federal authorities." Marcus replied, gesturing to the marshals beside him. One of the marshals, a stern-looking man with a thick mustache, urged his horse forward. "Mr. Cartwright, I'm Marshal Davis. We have legal authority to search these premises for stolen property. Stand aside." But Abraham had been thinking about this moment all day. "Marshal Davis, before you execute that warrant, I think you should know what kind of property we're talking about." Elizabeth appeared in the doorway behind Abraham, holding Catherine's metal box high enough for everyone to see. "Marcus, tell the marshal what's really in this box." Marcus's face went pale in the torchlight. "Elizabeth, put that down and come here right now." "Why?" Elizabeth called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Are you afraid they'll see Catherine's photographs? The one showing where you buried James Crawford after you beat him to death." A murmur ran through the assembled men. Several of them had known James Crawford. He had been a respected newspaper editor whose mysterious disappearance had troubled many people in Denver. Marshal Davis looked confused. "Judge Morrison, what is she talking about?" "She's delusional," Marcus said quickly. "My first wife, Catherine, killed herself 5 years ago. My current wife has been having episodes since her father died." Elizabeth opened the metal box and pulled out one of Catherine's photographs. Even in the flickering torchlight, the image was clear enough to see. A man lying dead in an alley, his face battered beyond recognition. "This is James Crawford," Elizabeth shouted. "Catherine photographed his body after you killed him. She documented everything." "That's enough," Marcus roared, drawing his pistol. "I won't listen to any more of these lies." But Marshal Davis held up his hand. "Hold on, Judge. Let me see that photograph." Abraham stepped forward. "Marshal, we have 12 photographs documenting 12 murders, plus written statements from witnesses, plus a letter in Judge Morrison's own handwriting planning James Crawford's death." The second marshal, a younger man named Wilson, was staring at Elizabeth with growing recognition. "Ma'am, are you saying Judge Morrison murdered James Crawford? Because I remember that case. Crawford was investigating vote buying in Denver when he disappeared." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Elizabeth replied, pulling out more photographs. "And he killed 11 other people too. Catherine Morrison documented it all before he murdered her and made it look like suicide." Marcus's composure finally shattered completely. "You stupid woman. You don't understand what forces you're dealing with. This network reaches all the way to Washington. You think 2 federal marshals can protect you?" Marshal Davis's eyes narrowed. "What network? Judge Morrison?" Marcus realized his mistake too late. In his anger, he had revealed more than he intended. I meant the legal system, the proper channels of justice." But Tom Bradley, who had been listening from a window, called out, "Marshal, there's a letter in that box addressed to someone called the Colonel about payments for murder." Marshal Wilson dismounted and approached the porch. "Ma'am, may I examine that evidence?" Elizabeth handed him Catherine's box, and as Wilson looked through the contents, his face grew grimmer with each piece. The photographs were damning enough, but the written statements from witnesses and Marcus's own letter sealed his fate. "Judge Morrison," Marshal Wilson said slowly, "I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of James Crawford and conspiracy to commit murder." "You can't arrest me," Marcus screamed. "I'm a federal judge. I have immunity." "Not for murder." "You don't," Marshal Davis replied, finally understanding the situation. He turned to his men. "Any of you who want to keep wearing federal badges will lay down your weapons right now." Most of Marcus's hired men were already backing away, realizing they had been lied to about the nature of their mission. They had signed on to help retrieve a runaway wife, not to cover up multiple murders. Only 5 men remained loyal to Marcus, and they were beginning to look nervous as they realized how outnumbered they suddenly were. Marcus, seeing his authority crumble, made a desperate decision. "If I can't have her, nobody can," he snarled, raising his pistol toward Elizabeth. Abraham's rifle came up instantly, but Marcus was faster. The judge's shot rang out across the yard just as Abraham fired. Elizabeth felt the bullet whistle past her ear as Abraham's shot took Marcus in the chest, spinning him off his horse. Marcus hit the ground hard, but wasn't dead. With his last breath of strength, he pulled a hidden derrick from his boot and aimed it at Elizabeth one final time. "Look out!" Sam Jenkins shouted from inside the house. Elizabeth saw the small gun in Marcus's hand and froze, knowing she couldn't dodge in time. But Tom Bradley had been moving around the side of the house, and his shot from the shadows took Marcus in the head, ending his threat forever. The yard fell silent except for the nervous whinnying of horses and the crackling of torches. Marcus Morrison lay still in the dirt, his reign of terror finally over. Marshal Davis holstered his weapon and approached Elizabeth. "Ma'am, on behalf of the federal government, I apologize for what you've been through. This evidence will help us expose the entire corruption network." Elizabeth sank to her knees, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. It was over. After years of living in fear, after running across half the country, after watching good people die because they threatened Marcus's power, it was finally over. Abraham knelt beside her and pulled her into his arms. "It's finished," he whispered. "You're safe now." But as Elizabeth looked at Catherine's photographs scattered in the dirt around Marcus's body, she knew it wasn't quite finished. There was still justice to be served, truth to be told, and a new life to be built from the ashes of the old one. The morning sun rose over Copper Creek like a promise of better days to come. Marshal Davis and Marshal Wilson had spent the night cataloging Catherine's evidence, and their faces grew grimmer with each piece they examined. By dawn, they had enough proof to bring down a corruption network that stretched from Denver to Washington, D.C. "Ma'am," Marshal Wilson said to Elizabeth as she sat on Abraham's porch, finally able to watch a sunrise without fear, "this evidence you and Catherine Morrison gathered is going to change everything. We've already sent telegrams to honest judges in 3 territories. By the end of the week, dozens of corrupt officials will be behind bars." Elizabeth nodded, but her expression remained solemn. "What about the families of Marcus's victims? They deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones." "They'll know," Marshal Davis promised. "We'll make sure every family gets closure. And there will be a substantial reward from the federal government for your courage in exposing this conspiracy." Abraham, who had been checking on his cattle, returned to hear the last part of the conversation. "She doesn't need any reward," he said firmly. "She's got everything she needs right here." Elizabeth looked at him with surprise. Over the past week, they had been through hell together, but they had never talked about what would happen next. Their marriage had been a legal fiction, a desperate arrangement made by 2 lonely people who barely knew each other. Marshal Wilson cleared his throat diplomatically. "Well, there are some legal matters to sort out. Mrs. Morrison, your marriage to the judge was legitimate, which means you're now his widow. You'll inherit his estate, which is considerable. I don't want his money," Elizabeth said immediately. "It's blood money. Every dollar came from corruption and murder." "Actually," Marshal Davis said, consulting his notes, "Judge Morrison's estate includes not just his personal wealth, but also funds he stole from various victims and bribes he collected over the years. The federal government plans to return that money to the families he destroyed and the communities he corrupted. But there will still be enough left to ensure you never have to worry about money again." Elizabeth stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over Abraham's land. The cattle were grazing peacefully, the mountains rose majestically in the distance, and everything seemed touched with the golden light of a new beginning. But she still had a choice to make. "Abraham," she said quietly, "you need to understand something. I'm free now, really free. I don't have to stay here if I don't want to. I could go anywhere, do anything, be anyone I choose to be." Abraham felt his heart sink, though he tried not to let it show on his face. Of course she would leave. Why would a woman with money and freedom want to stay on a struggling ranch with a man she had known for only a week? "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You've got your whole life ahead of you now. You should see the world, maybe go back east where there are museums and theaters and all the things a cultured lady like you would enjoy." Elizabeth turned to face him, and he was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "Is that what you think I want? Museums and theaters? Don't you?" Abraham asked, confused. "Abraham Cartwright, you're the most frustratingly noble man I have ever met," Elizabeth said, stepping closer to him. "For the past week, you've been willing to die to protect me, and now you're willing to let me go because you think it's what's best for me. But did it ever occur to you to ask what I want?" Abraham's heart began to beat faster. "What do you want?" "I want to wake up every morning without fear. I want to help build something good and honest and lasting. I want to be part of a community that stands up for what's right. I want to honor Catherine's memory by living the kind of life she would have wanted for herself." Elizabeth reached out and took his hands. "And I want to do all of that with you, if you'll have me." "Elizabeth," Abraham said softly, "are you sure? I'm just a rancher. I can't offer you the kind of life Marcus could have given you." "Marcus never gave me anything but bruises and nightmares," Elizabeth replied. "You gave me something worth more than all his wealth. You gave me back my courage. You showed me what it feels like to be protected instead of owned, respected instead of controlled." Abraham pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train, Elizabeth felt completely safe. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "Not the frightened woman who got off that train, not the brave woman who faced down a killer, but all of you. Every part of your story, every scar, every moment of courage." "I love you too," Elizabeth whispered back. "And I want to write the rest of my story with you." Marshall Davis cleared his throat again. "Well, there's still the small matter of your current marital status. Your marriage to Judge Morrison was legal, which means we need a proper wedding," Elizabeth finished with a smile. "A real one this time, with the community as witnesses. Word of the engagement spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. The same community that had been divided the week before now came together to plan a celebration. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store, insisted on making Elizabeth a proper wedding dress. Tom Bradley and his wife offered to host the reception at their ranch. Even the local preacher, who had initially been skeptical of the whole affair, now proclaimed it a triumph of love over evil. 3 weeks later, on a beautiful autumn morning, Elizabeth Morrison became Elizabeth Cartwright in a ceremony that half the territory attended. She wore a simple white dress with long sleeves that covered the last of her scars, and she carried wildflowers that Abraham had picked from their favorite spot by the creek. As they exchanged vows, Elizabeth thought about Catherine's hidden note and how it had started this whole journey. Catherine had written that note hoping to save one life, but in the end, she had saved dozens. The corruption network was being dismantled. The victims' families finally had answers, and Elizabeth had found not just freedom, but love. Do you, Abraham, take Elizabeth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, to protect and to cherish, for as long as you both shall live? "I do," Abraham said, his voice strong and sure. "And I promise to protect you always. Do you, Elizabeth, take Abraham to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, to stand with and support, for as long as you both shall live?" Elizabeth looked into Abraham's eyes and saw her future there, not as a possession to be owned, but as a partner to be loved. "I do," she said, "and I promise to stand with you always." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd could probably be heard in the next county. As Abraham kissed his bride, Elizabeth felt something she had never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Later, as they danced under the stars at their wedding reception, Abraham whispered in her ear, "Any regrets about staying in this little corner of nowhere?" Elizabeth smiled and looked around at their friends and neighbors, people who had risked their lives to stand up for what was right. "This isn't nowhere," she said. "This is home." 6 months later, Elizabeth received a letter from the federal government informing her that the last members of Marcus's corruption network had been sentenced to prison. The letter also contained a photograph that made her cry. A new headstone for Catherine Morrison's grave, with an inscription that read, "Beloved wife and unsung hero who died fighting for truth and justice." Elizabeth showed the photograph to Abraham as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. "She did it," Elizabeth said quietly. "Catherine brought them all down in the end." "You both did," Abraham corrected. "She started it, and you finished it." Elizabeth leaned against her husband's shoulder and felt the baby kick gently in her growing belly. Soon there would be a new life in the world, a child who would grow up knowing that sometimes courage and love really can triumph over fear and hatred. As the stars came out over their ranch, Elizabeth thought about the frightened woman who had stepped off that train so many months ago. That woman had been running from her past, clutching a hidden note, and hoping only to survive one more day. Now she was Elizabeth Cartwright, beloved wife, expectant mother, and pillar of her community. She had found not just safety, but purpose. Not just freedom, but love. Not just survival, but a life worth living. The hidden note was framed now, hanging in their kitchen as a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people willing to risk everything for the truth. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, courage and love really are enough to change the world.